The Saxon peoples arose out of the windswept marshes and the thick woodlands of the northern German plain in the first centuries of the Common Era. Their beginnings were woven into the larger mosaic of tribes that made up northern Germania, just beyond the edge of Rome's reach. These early Germanic groups took shape across three main regions that, though separate, were tied together by kinship and cultural bonds. One branch lived among the waterlogged lowlands of Holstein, where river valleys cut through the land and countless inlets opened onto the sea. Another spread across the rolling hills and waterways of Westphalia, where the Weser and the Möhne carved their paths toward the North Sea. A third occupied the broad heathlands that in time would lend their name to Lower Saxony. Northward, Saxon connections stretched onto the Jutland Peninsula, where archaeological finds show close contact with Danish tribes. Together they formed part of a larger North Sea cultural zone, an interconnected Germanic world that became vital to the Saxon identity. The land itself shaped their way of life. The North German plain was both generous and unforgiving. Its wide rivers, the Elbe, the Weser, the Ems, and their many tributaries, offered natural highways for movement and trade. But the same waterways, together with swamps and woodlands, also divided communities into scattered pockets of settlement. These natural barriers encouraged strong local identities within the broader Saxon world. Villages grew up separately, each adjusting to its own environment, yet they all kept a shared language and culture that held them together. The coast provided food from the sea and nurtured seafaring traditions that would one day carry the Saxons far beyond their homeland. Inland forests supplied wood, game, and natural defenses against enemies. Excavations in Holstein reveal how, as early as the 1st century AD, the Saxons adapted ingeniously to their environment. At sites such as Feddersen Weird, archaeologists uncovered villages raised on artificial mounds to withstand seasonal floods. At the center stood large communal halls, flanked by smaller houses and workshops. Populations ranged from 2 to 500, organized around extended families, the heart of Saxon society. The houses they built were strong enough to endure the damp winds of the North Sea. Heavy timber frames, filled with wattle and daub, provided shelter and stability. These were not crude huts, but carefully planned structures built to meet both physical and social needs. Politically, the Saxons did not form a single kingdom. Instead, they belonged to a shifting network of tribes bound together in a loose confederation. Each tribe had its own leaders, lands, and customs, but all shared common ancestry and traditions. This arrangement balanced independence with unity. When danger threatened, tribes could quickly gather warriors from across the confederation. When peace prevailed, each group lived according to its own ways. This system also gave them a framework for settling disputes. Tribes had long-established customs for negotiating differences, ensuring that trade and cooperation flowed across borders. At the center of Saxon social and political life stood the comitatus, bands of warriors who pledged loyalty to a leader. These groups were built on sacred oaths, stronger than blood ties, and they formed the backbone of Saxon power. The comitatus gave ambitious young men a path to rise in status. Bravery and loyalty could elevate a warrior's standing, regardless of birth. In return, leaders rewarded their companions with gifts, food, and honor. Archaeology has uncovered countless graves filled with spears, shields, and the occasional sword, reflecting both the martial culture of the Saxons and their skilled metalworking. Yet leadership was not absolute. The Saxons also prized a kind of rough democracy. Free men had the right to speak and decide important matters at tribal assemblies, called things. These gatherings were held in sacred groves or other revered sites, blending politics with religion. The thing was more than a council, it was a ceremony of unity. Disputes were settled, alliances forged, and decisions reached through discussion. Feasts and rituals followed, reinforcing the bonds of community. Far from being isolated tribes, the Saxons were part of far-reaching trade networks. Their pottery shows both local traditions and Roman influence, proof of exchange between the two worlds. Saxon smiths mastered metalwork, producing not just weapons but also delicate jewelry and ornaments decorated with intricate patterns of filigree and welded designs. Roman coins, glass, and luxury goods have been found in Saxon villages, exchanged for amber, furs, and other northern treasures. Burials offer vivid glimpses of Saxon society. Cremation dominated, with ashes placed in ceramic urns in large cemeteries used over generations. Grave goods reflected social rank. The elite were buried with weapons, ornaments, and imported luxuries, while ordinary people were laid to rest with simpler objects. Some graves even contained horses or were marked by ship-shaped stone settings, signs of the Saxons' strong seafaring tradition and their belief in the spiritual importance of mobility and the sea. Their maritime skills grew out of necessity. Early boats were little more than rowing vessels for rivers and coastal waters. Over time, Saxon shipbuilders developed more advanced designs. Burial sites with boats and ship-like monuments testify to the pride they took in seafaring. These skills connected them to distant markets and prepared them for the raids and migrations that would come centuries later. Roman writers first mention the Saxons in the 2nd century AD. Around 150, the geographer Ptolemy placed them in Holstein, alongside other well-documented Germanic tribes. By the 3rd century, Roman reports describe Saxons raiding coastal settlements and attacking shipping along the North Sea. Their growing naval strength soon made them a significant threat. Rome's response was to reinforce its coasts. Along Britain and Gaul, the empire built forts and harbors to guard against Saxon raiders. These defenses, however, also gave the Saxons valuable knowledge. By observing Roman patrols and fortifications, they learned the geography, weaknesses, and strategies of their powerful neighbor. This intelligence would later aid their invasions. Despite growing contact with Rome, Saxon villages in the Roman Iron Age retained deep continuity with their prehistoric past. They tended to settle on raised ground near rivers or coasts, balancing defense with access to trade and resources. Layouts were carefully planned. Homes grouped together, workshops kept apart, communal structures built for gatherings and rituals. Stores of grain and other supplies reveal how they adapted agriculture to the northern climate. Specialized craft areas suggest that economic life was diversifying, not merely subsistence-based. Religion infused every part of life. Sacred groves, springs, and rivers were central to worship. Offerings of weapons, ornaments, and precious goods were deposited in bogs and wetlands, symbols of devotion and community wealth. These practices reveal a spirituality tied closely to the land and its cycles, beliefs that would later blend with Christianity during their conversion. Language too offers clues to their early identity. Their speech was part of the West Germanic family, but with unique features that set them apart. Place names in Saxon lands point to how they understood their world, often tied to rivers, clearings, or defensive hills. Later records preserve Saxon legal terms, showing they already had developed ideas of property, responsibility, and collective law. The 3rd century marked a turning point. As populations grew and climates shifted, Saxons began moving beyond their homelands. Until then, their territories had remained relatively stable. Now, pressures within Germania, combined with larger migrations sweeping across Europe, pushed the Saxons toward new horizons. The collapse of Roman defenses along the Rhine created opportunities. The empire, weakened by civil wars and external invasions, pulled troops away from the frontier. Fortifications once manned by legions stood thinly guarded. Saxon warbands were quick to notice these cracks. What began as small raids grew into coordinated operations, as multiple tribes united to exploit Rome's weakness. Archaeology supports the story of mass migrations. In Holstein and Westphalia, entire villages appear to have been abandoned in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Rather than signs of destruction, these sites suggest organized departures, whole communities leaving to seek new lands. This was not chaotic flight, but carefully planned movement at the tribal level. It was in this period that Saxon naval power transformed. Their boats evolved from simple craft to sleek warships capable of sailing both rivers and open seas. Reconstructions of ships found at sites like Needham show vessels up to 75 feet long, manned by 30 or 40 oarsmen, able to carry warriors and supplies across great distances. Their flexible construction allowed them to endure rough seas, making them deadly tools of piracy. Raiding Britain became an organized business. Roman writers describe Saxon fleets launching coordinated strikes on wealthy estates, coastal towns, and religious centers. These raids were not random. They were carefully planned, based on detailed knowledge of tides, coasts, and defenses. Attacks often came at dawn or dusk, when defenders were least ready. Sometimes multiple targets were hit at once, stretching Roman forces thin. To counter these threats, Rome built a chain of fortifications known as the Saxon Shore. Stretching along Britain's southeast coast and across northern Gaul, the forts were massive, with walls 20 feet thick, ditches, and gate complexes designed for defense. Many had harbors where Roman ships could wait, ready to respond. Forts like Richborough, Dover, and Pevensey became strongholds against raiders. Portchester, one of the best preserved, enclosed 9 acres behind towering walls, with overlapping defenses and hundreds of soldiers stationed inside. Yet even these measures could not fully contain the Saxons. Recognizing this, Roman authorities tried a new tactic, hiring Saxon warriors as federates. These agreements gave Saxons land, pay, and legal status in exchange for military service against other tribes. For the Romans, it meant skilled Germanic fighters at their side. For the Saxons, it meant entry into Roman lands and resources, and a new stage in their expansion. The pressures that drove the Saxons outward were not only political but also environmental and demographic. Pollen studies taken from ancient bogs across their homeland reveal that, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Saxons had already been pushing their land to its limits. Forests were cleared, soils exhausted, and new settlements sprang up even in marginal areas. At first, this expansion supported a growing population. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, changing climate brought shorter growing seasons, more frequent crop failures, and even rising sea levels that ate into the low-lying coasts. The land could no longer sustain everyone. Archaeological traces of abandoned villages tell the story. Layers of wind-blown sand, peat buildup, and soil exhaustion suggest not sudden destruction but slow decline and abandonment. For many Saxon families, migration was not desperation but strategy, a decision made collectively, choosing to seek opportunity elsewhere. Meanwhile, far to the east, other great movements were underway. The advance of the Huns into Europe sent wave after wave of displacement westward. Gothic peoples were pushed from their Black Sea homelands, forcing them against their neighbors, who in turn pressed further west. This chain reaction rippled all the way to the North Sea. The Saxons suddenly found themselves hemmed in by new rivals and restless neighbors, competing for land and resources. But the Saxons were not passive victims of these changes. They adapted. Contact with Eastern peoples brought new technologies, composite bows, cavalry tactics, and innovations in weaponry. Archaeological finds of horse gear and weapons with step-like designs show that the Saxons adopted and reshaped these tools for their own warfare. For peoples already skilled at amphibious raids, the emphasis on mobility and fast-moving attacks fitted naturally into their way of war. As their naval power grew, Saxon raiders did not confine themselves to the coasts. Their shallow draft ships could sail far upriver, turning waterways into invasion routes. Roman accounts describe Saxon fleets navigating the Seine, the Loire, and other great rivers of Gaul, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles inland. From temporary camps along the riverbanks, they launched raids on wealthy estates, towns, and trade centers before withdrawing to the safety of the sea. Their tactics were flexible. On the coast, they favored surprise dawn attacks. Along rivers, scouts were sent ahead to detect obstacles or Roman defenses. If confronted by superior forces, the raiders could retreat swiftly downstream. The adaptability of these methods made them a constant threat, one Rome struggled to counter. The economic impact was profound. Trade routes declined as merchants avoided waters known for Saxon activity. Coastal estates were abandoned or fortified, shifting wealth inland. Prosperous ports shrank into shadows of their former selves. In some places, locals negotiated directly with raiders, paying tribute or supplies for protection. Others tried to form militias, though few could withstand Saxon assault without Roman support. During these centuries, Saxon life reflected a dual character. Some remained in their old homelands, others ventured out, and many balanced both. Archaeological evidence shows that while Saxons continued to occupy Holstein and Westphalia, they also began founding permanent bases across the Channel and along the Gaulish coast. What began as raiding slowly blended into colonization. This shift brought changes to their society. Leadership grew more centralized, with successful war leaders gaining wider authority. Shipbuilders, navigators, and craftsmen essential to seafaring gained new prestige. Wealth from raiding altered the social order, creating opportunities for advancement while also reinforcing the warrior ethos as the surest path to power. By the mid-5th century, events in Britain created the opening that would change Saxon history forever. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman legions had guarded the island. But with Rome weakening, its troops were recalled, leaving Britain exposed. Local Romano-British elites, accustomed to Roman protection, now struggled to defend themselves against mounting raids from the north and west, particularly by Picts and Scots. In their desperation, some British rulers turned to the Saxons. According to later accounts, most famously preserved in the writings of the historian Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a British king named Vortigern invited Saxon warriors to settle in Kent around 449 AD. 2 Saxon leaders, brothers named Hengist and Horsa, are said to have arrived with their followers, granted land in exchange for military service. Though the details of this story blend history with legend, archaeological evidence supports the broader picture. In the mid-5th century, large Saxon communities appeared in Kent. Excavations at sites like Mucking and West Stow reveal organized villages, not just temporary military camps. Pottery, house designs, and burial customs show continuity with Saxon traditions from the continent. These were settlers bringing their families, not mercenaries alone. Cemeteries from Kent, such as those at Fingalsham and Sarr, confirm the presence of complete communities, men, women, and children buried together, accompanied by grave goods reflecting both status and Saxon identity. High-ranking burials contained imported ornaments and weapons, while simpler graves held tools of daily life. The evidence points to deliberate colonization, carefully planned and sustained over generations. The layout of settlements in Kent reveals strategic thinking. Villages were established on elevated ground near rivers, offering both defense and access to farmland and trade routes. Communities were spaced at regular intervals, suggesting coordinated distribution of land. Elite burials containing rich goods indicate the rise of local aristocracies who organized and led these new societies. From Kent, Saxon settlement spread. In Sussex, sites like Bishopstone and Rookery Hill show communities positioned along rivers that linked inland farmlands with coastal resources. Settlers adapted their continental building techniques to local conditions, constructing homes from available materials while maintaining traditional cultural practices. Specialized workshops emerged for pottery, textiles, and metalwork, showing that these were not frontier camps but thriving, diverse communities. One of the most significant Saxon expansions was into the Thames Valley, where the Kingdom of Wessex would later rise. Archaeological evidence from Dorchester-on-Thames shows large, organized settlements with homes, craft areas, and ceremonial spaces. Finds of weapons alongside farming tools suggest that warrior traditions continued alongside developing agricultural and economic life. Here, Saxon settlers maintained ties with their continental kin. Pottery and jewelry styles reveal ongoing contact across the North Sea, even as distinct local features emerged. This blend of old and new would eventually give West Saxons their own identity. In Essex, Saxon settlement followed a somewhat different path. Here, the evidence suggests closer integration with existing Romano-British populations. Rather than complete displacement, Saxon settlers appear to have mingled with local communities, perhaps taking over old Roman estates or absorbing local practices. This blending points to the flexibility of Saxon settlement strategies, adapting to different political and cultural landscapes. Across all these regions, one theme is clear: what began as raiding fleets gradually turned into waves of settlement. The Saxons brought their families, traditions, and systems of leadership, laying down roots in the fertile lands of Britain. Over time, these colonies would grow into kingdoms, reshaping the island's political and cultural landscape. The Saxons who arrived in Britain were heirs to centuries of adaptation. From their marshy homelands and forested riversides, they had learned to endure harsh climates, to cooperate as tribes, to wage war with discipline, and to master the seas. The collapse of Roman power gave them the opportunity to carry those skills into new lands. Their story, however, was still only beginning. In Britain, they would carve out kingdoms, struggle with native Britons, confront new invaders, and eventually lay the foundations of England itself. Archaeological investigations at sites like Myking reveal mixed material. Assemblages that combined Saxon pottery and metalwork with Romano-British building techniques and settlement layouts. This pattern suggests a process of gradual cultural transformation, rather than wholesale population replacement, with Saxon elites assuming control over existing territorial and administrative frameworks while allowing continuity in local practices and population. The resistance mounted by Romano-British populations against Saxon expansion varied considerably across different regions and time periods, ranging from organized military campaigns to local defensive arrangements and diplomatic negotiations. The historical figure of Ambrosius Aurelianes emerges from contemporary sources as a significant British leader who organized effective resistance against Saxon territorial expansion. During the late 5th century, Gildas describes Ambrosia as a Roman-educated aristocrat who rallied British forces and achieved notable military successes against Saxon war bands, temporarily halting their westward expansion and establishing a period of relative stability that lasted for several decades. The military campaigns associated with Ambrosia Aurelianes reveal the sophisticated defensive capabilities that Romano-British populations could mobilize when properly organized and led. Archaeological evidence from hill forts across western Britain shows extensive refortification during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, with new defensive works constructed using both Roman engineering techniques and adaptations suited to contemporary military threats. Sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset reveal massive defensive earthworks and evidence for substantial garrison forces, suggesting coordinated defensive strategies that could effectively challenge Saxon military superiority. The Arthurian legends, while heavily mythologized in later medieval literature, appear to preserve genuine historical memories of British resistance to Saxon expansion during this crucial period. The core narrative of a British war leader who achieved significant military victories against Saxon forces align with contemporary evidence for effective Romano-British resistance during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Archaeological investigations at sites traditionally associated with Arthur, such as Tintourill and Glastonbury, have revealed evidence for high-status occupation during the appropriate time period, including imported Mediterranean pottery and luxury goods that suggest contact with continental trade networks, and the resources necessary to support major military campaigns. The Battle of Ben Hill, mentioned by Gildas as a decisive British victory that halted Saxon expansion for a generation, represents the culmination of organized Romano-British resistance during this period. While the exact location and date of this engagement remain disputed, the historical impact described by contemporary sources suggests a significant military defeat that forced Saxon groups to consolidate their existing territories rather than continue aggressive expansion. Archaeological evidence from Saxon settlements shows a marked change in material culture during the early 6th century, with reduced evidence for new territorial expansion and increased emphasis on internal development and agricultural intensification. The establishment of early Saxon kingdoms during the 6th century represented a fundamental transformation from the tribal confederation structures that had characterized continental Saxon society. The kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, Essex, and Wessex each developed distinctive political institutions that combined Germanic traditions with adaptations to local British conditions and populations. Kent, under the leadership of kings like Ethelbert, established sophisticated legal codes and administrative structures that governed both Saxon and British populations within their territories. The Kentish royal court attracted continental merchants and craftsmen, creating a cosmopolitan environment that facilitated cultural exchange and economic development. The Kingdom of Sussex developed along somewhat different lines, with archaeological evidence suggesting a more militarized society focused on territorial defense and expansion. The South Saxon kings maintained closer connections with continental Saxon territories, as evidenced by material culture that shows continued importation of Germanic goods and artistic styles. The presence of substantial weapon deposits and Sussex burials indicates the continued importance of warrior culture in South Saxon society, while the distribution of high-status settlements suggests territorial organization based on military control rather than administrative efficiency. Essex presents yet another model of Saxon kingdom development with evidence for closer integration with existing Romano-British administrative and economic structures. The East Saxon kings appear to have inherited and adapted Roman territorial divisions, maintaining urban centers like London as a commercial and administrative hubs while establishing Saxon control over surrounding agricultural areas. The material culture from Essex shows remarkable continuity with Romano-British traditions in areas like pottery production and building techniques, suggesting a process of cultural synthesis rather than wholesale replacement. The gradual displacement and assimilation of Celtic and Romano-British populations follow different patterns in various regions, influenced by factors including population density, economic resources, and the strength of local resistance. In areas like Kent and Sussex, where Saxon settlement was most intensive, archaeological evidence suggests significant demographic change, with Romano-British material culture largely replaced by Saxon traditions within a few generations. However, even in these areas, certain elements of British culture persisted, particularly in agricultural techniques, place names, and religious practices that would later influence Saxon development. The Thames Valley presents a more complex picture of population interaction with evidence for sustained coexistence between Saxon and British communities throughout the 6th century. Archaeological investigations reveal settlements where Saxon and British material cultures appear side by side, suggesting either peaceful coexistence or gradual cultural assimilation rather than violent displacement. The presence of mixed burial assemblages containing both Saxon and British grave goods indicates intermarriage and cultural exchange that created hybrid identities combining elements from both traditions. The linguistic evidence for Saxon-British interaction reveals the extent to which existing populations influence Saxon development even in areas of intensive Germanic settlement. The survival of British river names, topographical features, and settlement names throughout Saxon territories indicates the continued presence of British populations who served as sources of local knowledge and cultural continuity. The adoption of British agricultural techniques and land management practices by Saxon settlers demonstrates practical adaptation to local environmental conditions that required cooperation with existing populations. The religious landscape during the Saxon settlement period reflects the complex interaction between Germanic paganism, Romano-British Christianity, and Celtic religious traditions. Archaeological evidence from Saxon cemeteries reveals burial practices that combine continental Germanic traditions with local adaptations, including the occasional presence of Christian symbols alongside traditional pagan grave goods. The persistence of Romano-British churches and religious sites in areas of Saxon settlement suggests either tolerance for existing religious practices or gradual conversion processes that preserved elements of earlier traditions. The economic transformation of Britain during the Saxon settlement period involved fundamental changes in trade networks, craft production, and agricultural organization. The collapse of Roman commercial systems created opportunities for new economic arrangements based on Saxon connections with continental markets and different approaches to resource exploitation. Archaeological evidence reveals the development of specialized craft production centers that served regional markets while maintaining connections with continental suppliers and customers. The presence of continental imports in Saxons and settlements indicates the maintenance of North Sea trade networks that provided access to luxury goods, raw materials, and technological innovations, while their kinsmen across the North Sea were establishing kingdoms in post-Roman Britain. The Saxon tribes who remained in their ancestral homeland along the Weser and Ella rivers found themselves facing an entirely different existential challenge. The rise of Frankish power under the Carolingian dynasty brought systematic pressure against the last major pagan stronghold in Western Europe. As Charlemagne's armies began probing Saxon territories with increasing frequency and determination, the continental Saxons had maintained their traditional confederation structure, their ancient religious practices, and their fierce independence for centuries while Rome fell and new Christian kingdoms emerged around them. Their decentralized political organization, which had served them well against earlier threats, would prove both a strength and a fatal weakness in the face of Charlemagne's methodical approach to conquest and conversion. The Saxon territories that Charlemagne inherited as his primary targets stretched across the North German plain, from the Rhine eastward to the Elbe, encompassing the river valleys of the Ems, Weser, and their numerous tributaries. This vast region supported a population estimated at several hundred people organized into three primary tribal divisions. The Phalians, occupying the lands between the Rhine and Weser. The Angrians settled along the middle Vsa valley and extending northward toward the coast, and the Eastphalians controlling territories from the Weser to the Elbe and southward into the Harz Mountains. Each division maintained its own assembly of nobles and free men, its own military organization, and its own sacred sites, creating a complex political landscape that lacked the centralized authority structures that had made other Germanic peoples easier targets for Frankish expansion. The religious significance of Saxon resistance cannot be understated, as their territories contained some of the most important pagan cult sites in northern Europe. The Mansel, a massive wooden pillar or tree trunk that served as the axis connecting earth to the heavens in Saxon cosmology, stood at Eresburg in Westphalian territory and drew pilgrims from across the Germanic world. Archaeological evidence suggests this site had been sacred for centuries, with ritual deposits and votive offerings indicating continuous religious activity that reinforced Saxon identity and provided supernatural sanction for resistance against Christian invaders. The destruction of such sites would become a primary objective in Charlemagne's campaign, as he recognized that military conquest alone could not achieve lasting control over a population whose identity was so thoroughly intertwined with their traditional religious practices. The initial Frankish probes into Saxon territory during the 760s revealed both the military capabilities of Saxon warriors and the challenges posed by their guerrilla tactics. Saxon forces typically avoided pitched battles against the heavily armored Frankish cavalry, instead employing hit and run attacks that maximized their knowledge of local terrain while minimizing their exposure to superior Frankish military technology. Saxon warriors were skilled in forest warfare, using the dense woodlands that covered much of their territory to launch surprise attacks against Frankish supply trains and isolated garrisons before melting away into familiar landscapes where pursuit was nearly impossible. Their intimate knowledge of river crossings, hidden paths, and defensible positions gave them significant tactical advantages that offset Frankish superiority in equipment and formal military training. Charlemagne's decision to launch a systematic conquest of Saxony in 772 represented a fundamental shift from the limited border raids and defensive campaigns that had characterized previous Frankish-Saxon interactions. The king assembled a substantial army that included not only his elite cavalry, but also infantry forces capable of siege warfare and engineers, equipped with the tools necessary to reduce Saxon fortifications. The campaign began with a direct assault on Eresburg, the fortified site that protected the Mansel sanctuary, demonstrating Charlemagne's understanding. The successful conquest required the destruction of Saxon religious as well as political resistance. The capture and destruction of the Mansel sent shock waves throughout Saxon society as the failure of their supreme deity to protect his most sacred shrine called into question the supernatural foundations of Saxon resistance. The Frankish army that crossed into Saxon territory in 772 represented the most sophisticated military machine in Western Europe, with tactical innovations that had been developed through decades of successful campaigns against Lombards, Bavarians, and other enemies. Charlemagne's heavy cavalry formed the core of his striking force, with warriors mounted on specially bred war horses and equipped with long spears, swords, and protective armor that made them nearly invulnerable to Saxon infantry attacks in open terrain. These mounted warriors were supported by infantry forces that included both Frankish levies and allied troops from recently conquered territories, creating a combined arms force capable of adapting to different tactical situations and terrain conditions. The destruction of the German soul marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate Saxon religious infrastructure and replace it with Christian institutions. Frankish forces targeted sacred groves, springs, and other cult sites throughout Saxon territory, often constructing churches or monasteries on the same locations to demonstrate the triumph of Christianity over paganism. This religious warfare created profound psychological pressure on Saxon populations as the apparent inability of their traditional gods to protect sacred sites undermined confidence in the supernatural support that had sustained their resistance. The replacement of familiar religious landmarks with our alien Christian structures served as constant reminders of defeat and foreign domination that penetrated deeply into Saxon consciousness. Widukind of Westphalia emerged as the most significant leader of Saxon resistance during the early phases of Charlemagne's conquest, demonstrating the military and political skills necessary to coordinate opposition across the traditional tribal divisions. Archaeological evidence from Westphalian sites suggests that Widukind commanded resources and authority that extended well beyond his immediate tribal territory, with weapon deposits and fortification works indicating coordinated defensive preparations involving multiple Saxon groups. The ability to maintain organized resistance for over a decade despite repeated military defeats testifies to both his personal charisma and the depth of Saxon opposition to Frankish domination. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed under Widukind's leadership proved remarkably effective against Frankish conventional forces, forcing Charlemagne to adapt his military strategies to counter an enemy who refused to engage in the type of decisive battles that had brought victory in other campaigns. Saxon war bands struck at Frankish supply lines, isolated garrisons, and newly established Christian settlements with devastating effect, often coordinating simultaneous attacks across wide geographical areas that prevented effective Frankish response. These operations required sophisticated intelligence networks and communication systems that demonstrated the continued vitality of Saxon political organization. Despite the destruction of formal governmental structures, the establishment of Frankish administrative control over conquered Saxon territories proved far more difficult than the initial military conquest, as Saxon populations employed passive resistance and periodic rebellion to undermine Frankish authority. Charlemagne's attempts to govern through appointed counts and other Frankish officials met with limited success, as these administrators lacked the local knowledge and cultural understanding necessary to maintain order among a hostile population. The constant threat of Saxon uprising required the maintenance of substantial military garrisons that drained Frankish resources while providing targets for renewed Saxon attacks. The Capitulio Diartibus Saxoni, promulgated around 785, represented Charlemagne's most systematic attempt to transform Saxon society through legal coercion and religious conversion. This comprehensive legal code imposed Christianity on all Saxon populations while prescribing death penalties for a wide range of traditional practices, including pagan worship, cremation of the dead, and refusal to accept baptism. The document reveals the extent to which Charlemagne recognized that military conquest alone could not achieve lasting control over Saxon territories, as sustainable domination required fundamental changes in Saxon cultural identity and social organization. The legal provisions of the Capitulatio demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Charlemagne's assault on Saxon culture, extending far beyond simple religious conversion to encompass virtually every aspect of traditional life. The code prohibited Saxon assemblies unless authorized by Frankish officials, effectively destroying the democratic institutions that had governed Saxon society for centuries. Traditional legal practices, including trial by ordeal and compensation payments for crimes, were replaced with Frankish legal procedures that Saxon populations neither understood nor accepted as legitimate. The requirement that all Saxons pay church tithes imposed a financial burden that supported the very institution responsible for destroying their traditional culture. The mass deportations that accompanied the implementation of the capitulatio represented perhaps the most brutal aspect of Charlemagne's Saxon policy, as entire communities were forcibly relocated to distant parts of the Frankish Empire where they could be more easily controlled and converted. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Saxon settlements reveals the sudden cessation of occupation at sites that had been continuously inhabited for centuries, with household goods and agricultural tools left behind by populations who had no opportunity to prepare for their forced departure. These deportations disrupted family networks, destroyed local knowledge systems, and eliminated the cultural continuity that sustained Saxon resistance. The replacement of deported Saxon populations with Frankish colonists created new demographic patterns that fundamentally altered the character of Saxon territories. These colonists brought different agricultural techniques, settlement patterns, and social organizations that gradually transformed the landscape in ways that made it increasingly difficult for surviving Saxon populations to maintain their traditional way of life. The establishment of Frankish churches, monasteries, and administrative centers in former Saxon territories created new focal points of authority and cultural influence that competed with and ultimately replaced traditional Saxon institutions. The executions at Verdun in 782 mark the most notorious episode of Charlemagne Saxon Wars, when approximately 4,500 Saxon prisoners were beheaded in a single day following their surrender after the Battle of the Sunil Mountains. This mass execution shocked contemporary observers and created lasting resentment among Saxon populations who had previously viewed warfare as a limited activity governed by traditional rules of conduct. The scale of the killings went far beyond anything in previous Germanic warfare, representing a fundamental shift toward total war that aimed at the complete destruction of Saxon resistance, rather than traditional objectives like tribute or territorial concessions. The immediate aftermath of the Verdun executions revealed the counterproductive nature of Charlemagne's extreme measures, as Saxon populations who had been considering submission were instead driven to renewed resistance by the demonstration of Frankish brutality. Widukind, who'd been negotiating potential surrender terms, resumed active military operations with increased support from Saxon populations, who now understood that submission offered no guarantee of survival. The executions also damaged Charlemagne's reputation among other Germanic peoples, who began to question whether the Frankish promises of fair treatment could be trusted. The renewed Saxon uprising that followed the Verdun executions demonstrated the continued vitality of Saxon military organization. Despite years of warfare and systematic oppression, Saxon forces launched coordinated attacks across multiple fronts, temporarily driving Frankish garrisons from large areas of conquered territory, and destroying many of the churches and administrative centers that had been established to consolidate Frankish control. The sophistication of these operations, involving simultaneous attacks separated by hundreds of miles, revealed the existence of communication networks and command structures that had survived despite Frankish efforts to destroy Saxon political organization. The gradual exhaustion of Saxon resistance during the final phase of the wars reflected not military defeat but the cumulative impact of decades of warfare, deportation, and cultural destruction that had undermined the foundations of Saxon society. Archaeological evidence from Saxon settlements shows declining population levels, reduced craft production, and increasing reliance on Frankish trade goods that indicate growing dependence on the very system that Saxon resistance sought to oppose. The death or exile of traditional leadership, the destruction of religious sites, and the disruption of agricultural cycles created cascading effects that made sustained resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. Widukin's eventual submission and baptism in 785 symbolized the end of organized Saxon resistance, though the ceremony itself revealed the pragmatic calculations that motivated this decision rather than genuine religious conversion. Contemporary accounts describe the baptism as a carefully negotiated political arrangement that guaranteed Widukin's personal safety and allowed him to retain limited authority over his followers in exchange for acknowledging Frankish supremacy and accepting Christian conversion. The terms of this agreement suggest that even in defeat, Saxon leaders retained sufficient bargaining power to negotiate conditions for their submission rather than accepting unconditional surrender. The integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire required fundamental changes in administrative, legal, and religious structures that gradually transformed the character of Saxon society. The establishment of bishoprics at Bremen and other Saxon centers created new sources of authority and cultural influence that competed with traditional Saxon institutions while providing mechanisms for ongoing supervision of the converted population. These ecclesiastical establishments serve not only religious functions, but also administrative and educational roles that gradually created new forms of Saxon identity compatible with Frankish imperial objectives. The long-term consequences of Charlemagne's Saxon wars extended far beyond the immediate military and political objectives to encompass fundamental changes in the demographic, cultural, and religious landscape of Northern Europe. The destruction of Saxon paganism eliminated the last major non-Christian religious system in Western Europe, while the integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire created new patterns of trade, communication, and cultural exchange that would influence European development for centuries. The survival of Saxon legal traditions within the broader framework of Carolingian law preserved important elements of Germanic legal culture while adapting them to Christian and imperial requirements. The emergence of consolidated Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the scattered settlements and warbands of the previous century represented a fundamental transformation in the political landscape of early medieval Britain as tribal confederations gave way to sophisticated territorial monarchies capable of sustained military campaigns, complex diplomatic relationships, and elaborate administrative systems. The period from 600 to 800 AD witnessed the crystallization of what later chroniclers would term the Heptarchy, 7 major kingdoms that dominated Anglo-Saxon England through shifting alliances, territorial conquests, and the gradual accumulation of resources that allowed successful rulers to project power far beyond their original tribal boundaries. These kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia, each developed distinctive political institutions, cultural characteristics, and territorial ambitions that would shape the course of English history for centuries to come. The Kingdom of Kent emerged as the first, truly sophisticated Anglo-Saxon political entity under the leadership of Ethelbert, whose reign from approximately 560 to 616 AD established many of the institutional foundations that other kingdoms would later adopt and adapt to their own circumstances. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury and other Kentish sites reveals the development of specialized craft production centers, the construction of substantial royal halls, and the accumulation of luxury goods that indicate both the economic prosperity and the political stability necessary to support elaborate court culture. Ethelbert's marriage to Bertha, the Frankish princess and Christian, created diplomatic connections with continental Europe that brought Kent into the broader network of relationships connecting the emerging kingdoms of post-Roman Western Europe. The Kentish royal court under Ethelbert attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan environment that facilitated cultural exchange and technological innovation. Archaeological excavations at royal sites have uncovered evidence for sophisticated metal working, including the production of elaborate jewelry and weapons that combined Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions with techniques and motifs borrowed from Frankish, Byzantine, and even Mediterranean sources. The presence of imported goods, including wine, silk, and precious stones, indicates trade relationships that extended across Europe and into the Eastern Mediterranean, demonstrating the resources and connections available to successful Anglo-Saxon rulers. The development of written law codes under Ethelbert marked a crucial innovation in Anglo-Saxon governance as traditional oral legal traditions were codified into systematic, written documents that could be applied consistently across territorial boundaries and social groups. The laws of Ethel, preserved in manuscripts from later centuries, reveal sophisticated legal concepts, including graduated penalties for different classes of victims, detailed provisions for property rights, and complex procedures for resolving disputes between individuals of a different social status. These legal innovations provided mechanisms for governing ethnically diverse populations that included not only Anglo-Saxon settlers but also Romano-British inhabitants and foreign merchants who required predictable legal frameworks to conduct their activities safely. Mercuria's rise to prominence during the 7th and 8th centuries demonstrated the potential for inland kingdoms to achieve dominance through aggressive territorial expansion and sophisticated military organization. Under kings like Penda and his successors, Mercia expanded from its original territories in the Upper Trent Valley to control vast areas of central England, creating a kingdom that stretched from the Welsh borders to the North Sea and from the Thames Valley northward into Yorkshire. This expansion required not only military success, but also administrative innovations that could integrate conquered territories and populations into a coherent political system capable of mobilizing resources for further campaigns. The Meon military system under Penda and his successors represented a significant evolution from the warband structures of earlier periods, incorporating elements that would later influence medieval military organization throughout Europe. Archaeological evidence from Mercian royal sites reveals the existence of specialized weapon production centers capable of equipping large armies with standardized equipment, while burial evidence suggests the development of a military aristocracy bound to the king through elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation. The presence of substantial earthwork fortifications at sites like Tamworth indicates the resources available to Mercian rulers and their ability to coordinate large-scale construction projects that required the mobilization of thousands of workers. Northumbria's emergence as a major power combined the military traditions of two originally separate kingdoms, Benicia and Dara, whose union under Edwin and his successors created the largest and most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of the 7th century. The Northumbrian kingdom at its height controlled territories extending from the Humber northward to the Forth, encompassing not only Anglo-Saxon settlements, but also substantial British and Pictish populations who retain their own cultural traditions while acknowledging Northumbrian political supremacy. This ethnic diversity required sophisticated governmental approaches that could accommodate different legal traditions, religious practices, and social organizations within a single political framework. The concept of Bretwald or Briton ruler emerged during this period as successful kings sought to extend their authority beyond their own territorial boundaries, to exercise overlordship over neighboring kingdoms. Bede's list of rulers who held this position reveals the shifting balance of power between the major kingdoms, with supremacy passing from Kent to Sussex to Wessex to East Anglia to Northumbria and finally to Mercia as different kingdoms achieved temporary dominance through military success, diplomatic skill, or economic resources. The Bretwalder concept represented more than simple military conquest, encompassing tribute relationships, marriage alliances, and religious patronage that created networks of obligation and influence extending across Anglo-Saxon England. The political dynamics underlying Bretwalder status involved complex calculations of military capability, economic resources, and diplomatic relationships that required successful rulers to maintain delicate balances between cooperation and competition with their royal peers. Archaeological evidence from royal sites reveals the material culture associated with overlordship, including elaborate weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that serve both practical and symbolic functions in maintaining royal authority. The famous Sutton Hoo burial complex provides remarkable insight into the resources available to East Anglian rulers during their period of prominence, with grave goods that include weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects drawn from across the known world. The Sutton Hoo ship burial represents perhaps the most spectacular archaeological evidence for the wealth and international connections of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with grave goods that demonstrate trade relationships extending from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean. The burial chamber contained remarkable assemblage of objects including a Swedish helmet, Frankish coins, Byzantine silver, and locally produced jewelry that reveals the complex networks of exchange and diplomacy that connected Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the broader European world. The ship itself, over 90 feet in length and capable of carrying a crew of 40 oarsmen, demonstrates the continued importance of maritime connections in Anglo-Saxon political and economic life. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England began with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 AD, an initiative sponsored by Pope Gregory the Great that represented the first systematic attempt to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms since their establishment in Britain. Augustine's arrival at the court of Aethelbert created a crucial precedent for the relationship between royal authority and religious conversion, as the king's acceptance of Christianity provided legitimacy and protection for missionary activities while creating new sources of royal authority based on divine sanction. The establishment of the Archbishopric of Canterbury provided an institutional framework for ongoing Christian development while maintaining connections with Rome that brought Anglo-Saxon England into the broader community of European Christendom. The Roman mission's approach to conversion emphasized the adaptation of existing religious sites and practices rather than their complete destruction, a pragmatic strategy that facilitated acceptance of Christianity while preserving elements of traditional culture that could be incorporated into Christian frameworks. Archaeological evidence from converted pagan temple sites reveals the construction of Christian churches on locations that have been sacred for centuries, with building materials and architectural elements from earlier structures incorporated into new Christian buildings. This continuity of sacred space helped ease the transition from paganism to Christianity while providing familiar focal points for religious devotion. The Celtic Christian tradition, established in northern and western Britain through the missionary activities of figures like Columba and Aidan, represented an alternative approach to Christianization that emphasized monastic communities' ascetic practices and distinctive liturgical traditions that had developed in relative isolation from continental European Christianity. The monastery of Iona, founded by Columba in 563 AD, became a major center for missionary activity that extended Celtic Christian influence throughout Scotland and northern England. The distinctive artistic traditions associated with Celtic Christianity, including elaborate manuscript illumination and sculptural decoration, created cultural expressions that would profoundly influence Anglo-Saxon artistic development. The encounter between Roman and Celtic Christian traditions in Anglo-Saxon England created tensions that extended beyond simple theological differences to encompass questions of ecclesiastical authority, liturgical practice, and cultural identity. The most visible manifestation of these differences involved the calculation of Easter, with Roman and Celtic churches following different systems that resulted in the celebration of Christianity's most important feast on different dates. The practical implications of this disagreement extended to questions of monastic or baptismal practices and episcopal authority that affected the daily lives of Christian communities throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD represented the crucial moment when these competing Christian traditions were forced to confront their differences and establish unified practices for the Northumbrian Church. King Oswic of Northumbria presided over debates between representatives of both traditions, with Wilfrid arguing for Roman practices and Colman defending Celtic traditions. The king's decision to adopt Roman practices established a precedent that would influence Christian development throughout Anglo-Saxon England, while demonstrating the crucial role of royal authority in determining religious policy. The synod's outcome represented not simply a theological victory, but a political decision that aligned Anglo-Saxon Christianity with continental European practices and institutions. The aftermath of the Synod of Whitby saw the gradual standardization of Christian practices throughout Anglo-Saxon England, with Celtic monasteries either adopting Roman customs or losing their influence to newly established institutions that followed continental models. The departure of Colman and other Celtic clergy who refused to accept the synod's decisions created opportunities for the appointment of new ecclesiastical leaders trained in Roman traditions and committed to implementing standardized practices. This transition facilitated the development of more systematic approaches to Christian education, missionary activity, and ecclesiastical administration that would characterize Anglo-Saxon Christianity for centuries. The development of Anglo-Saxon law codes during this period reflected the gradual integration of Christian moral principles with traditional Germanic legal practices, creating hybrid systems that addressed the needs of increasingly complex societies while maintaining continuity with ancestral traditions. The laws of Ina of Wessex, promulgated around 690 AD, demonstrate sophisticated approaches to regulating Christian behavior while preserving essential elements of Anglo-Saxon social organization. These codes addressed issues ranging from marriage and inheritance to criminal penalties and ecclesiastical privileges, creating comprehensive legal frameworks that could govern diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds and religious commitments. The ecclesiastical provisions in Anglo-Saxon law codes reveal the growing influence of Christian institutions in secular governance, with churches and monasteries receiving legal protections and privileges that enhance their ability to accumulate property and influence political decisions. The requirement that kings consult with ecclesiastical authorities on important matters created new sources of royal legitimacy while providing Christian institutions with opportunities to shape political policy. The development of sanctuary rights, clerical immunity from secular prosecution, and ecclesiastical courts created parallel legal systems that competed with traditional Anglo-Saxon judicial institutions. The cultural achievements of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during this period encompassed remarkable innovations in manuscript production, architectural design, and artistic expression that demonstrated both the resources available to successful kingdoms and their connections to broader European cultural developments. The development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon scripts, including the elegant, minuscule hands used for luxury manuscripts, facilitated the production of books that combined practical utility with aesthetic excellence. The monasteries of Northumbria, particularly Wearmouth Jarrow, under the leadership of Benedict Biscop, became major centers for manuscript production that created works of international significance. The architectural innovations of Anglo-Saxon church building reflected both practical needs and symbolic aspirations, with structures that incorporated continental European design elements while adapting to local materials and construction techniques. The Church of St. Peter at Wearmouth, built under Benedict Biscop's direction using stonemasons and glaziers brought from Gaul, established new standards for ecclesiastical architecture that influenced church construction throughout Anglo-Saxon and England. The use of imported materials, including window glass, decorative stonework, and architectural sculpture, demonstrated the resources available to major monasteries while creating buildings that served as symbols of Christian triumph and royal patronage. The development of Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions during this period created distinctive styles that combined Germanic decorative motifs with Christian iconography and classical influences drawn from continental European sources. The remarkable metal work found in royal burials demonstrates sophisticated techniques, including Cuisson enamel, filigree decoration, and pattern welding that required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. The production of elaborate jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects served not only aesthetic functions, but also political purposes, as the display of luxury goods reinforced royal authority while demonstrating the prosperity of successful kingdoms. The manuscript illumination traditions that developed in Anglo-Saxon monasteries created some of the most remarkable artistic achievements of early medieval Europe, combining Celtic decorative traditions with classical figural styles and innovative approaches to page layout and design. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 715 AD, demonstrates the sophisticated artistic capabilities of Anglo-Saxon scripturums while revealing the complex cultural influences that shaped religious art. The intricate interlace patterns, elaborate initial letters, and sophisticated use of color created visual experiences that enhance the spiritual impact of sacred texts while demonstrating the technical skills and artistic vision of their creators. The economic foundations supporting these cultural achievements rested on agricultural innovations, craft specialization, and trade networks that generated the surplus resources. necessary to support non-productive activities like manuscript production and monumental architecture. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing agricultural productivity during this period with new crops, improved tools, and more efficient land management techniques that supported growing populations while generating surplus production for trade and tribute. The development of specialized craft. Production centers created concentrations of skilled artisans whose products could be traded across long distances while serving local elite consumption needs. The social fabric of Saxon society rested upon a carefully structured hierarchy that permeated every aspect of daily existence, from the allocation of land and resources to the administration of justice and the conduct of religious ceremonies. At the apex of this system stood the king, whose authority derived not merely from military prowess, but from a complex web of ancestral legitimacy, divine sanction, and practical control over the distribution of wealth and land. Saxon kings maintained their position through the careful management of warrior retinues, the strategic allocation of royal estates, and the performance of ceremonial duties that reinforced their connection to both earthly power and supernatural authority. The royal household itself functioned as the administrative center of the kingdom, with specialized officials managing everything from the collection of tribute to the maintenance of royal weapons and the preparation of the elaborate feasts that demonstrated royal generosity and prosperity. Beneath the king in the social hierarchy stood the earls, a noble class whose status derived from their ownership of substantial landed estates, their ability to maintain armed followers, and their participation in the royal council that advised the king on matters of war, law, and governance. These nobles typically controlled territories that included multiple villages and their surrounding agricultural lands, generating the resources necessary to support households that might include dozens of dependents, ranging from household warriors to specialized craftsmen. The Eorls' estates served as local centers of authority where justice was administered, military service organized, and economic activities coordinated. Archaeological evidence from high-status Saxon settlements reveals the material culture associated with noble rank, including elaborate weapons, imported luxury goods, and substantial timber. Halls that could accommodate the large gatherings necessary for maintaining social and political relationships. The warrior retinues that surrounded Saxon kings and nobles represented one of the most distinctive features of Saxon political organization, creating bonds of personal loyalty that transcended traditional kinship ties while providing the military foundation for royal authority. These comitatus groups typically consisted of young men who had sworn personal oaths to their lord, binding themselves through sacred ceremonies that involved the exchange of weapons, rings, and other symbols of mutual obligation. The warriors received not only weapons and equipment from their lord, but also regular gifts of gold, silver, and other valuables that demonstrated their status while creating ongoing obligations for continued service. The relationship between lord and warrior was reciprocal, with the lord providing protection, sustenance, and opportunities for glory in exchange for absolute loyalty and military service that could extend to death in battle. The institution of the comitus created a military aristocracy that was both highly effective in warfare and deeply integrated into Saxon political and social structures. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could expect promotion within the retinue hierarchy, with senior warriors receiving substantial grants of land that allowed them to establish their own households and recruit their own followers. The religious landscape of Saxon society reflected the complex interaction between traditional Germanic paganism and Christianity, creating syncretic belief systems that incorporated elements from both traditions while adapting to local conditions and social needs. Saxon paganism centered around a pantheon of deities associated with war, fertility, wisdom, and natural phenomena, with Woden serving as the primary god of war and kingship through no controlling thunder and storms, and Frigg governing domestic affairs and fertility. Sacred sites included natural features like groves, springs, and hilltops, as well as constructed temples and ceremonial centers where communities gathered for religious festivals and ritual activities. The conversion to Christianity transformed Saxon religious practices while preserving many traditional elements that were reinterpreted within Christian frameworks. Sacred sites often retain their religious significance, with Christian churches constructed on locations that had been centers of pagan worship for centuries. The Christian calendar incorporated seasonal festivals that had marked important agricultural and social cycles in pagan tradition. But Christian saints assumed roles previously filled by pagan deities. The process of conversion varied considerably across different regions and social groups, with royal courts typically converting first for political reasons, while rural populations often maintained traditional practices alongside Christian observances for generations. Burial customs provide crucial insights into Saxon religious beliefs and social structures, revealing changes over time that reflect both internal social developments and external religious influences. Early Saxon burials typically involve cremation with ashes placed in ceramic urns accompanied by grave goods that included personal possessions, weapons, and jewelry that the deceased would need in the afterlife. The presence of elaborate grave goods in high-status burials demonstrates belief in an afterlife where social distinctions continued and material possessions retain their importance. The gradual transition to inhumation burial reflects Christian influence while preserving many traditional elements, including the continued inclusion of grave goods and the maintenance of cemetery sites that served multiple generations. The mythology preserved in Saxon literature and oral tradition reveals a worldview that emphasized heroic achievement, loyalty to kinship and lordship bonds, and acceptance of fate, while striving for glory that would ensure remembrance after death. The concept of weird, often translated as fate or destiny, played a central role in Saxon thinking about human agency and divine will, suggesting a complex understanding of causation that balanced individual responsibility with supernatural influence. Heroes in Saxon mythology typically faced impossible odds while maintaining their honor and loyalty, creating models for behavior that reinforced social values while providing entertainment and moral instruction. Festival traditions marked important transitions in the agricultural year while reinforcing community bonds and religious commitments that sustained Saxon social cohesion. The midwinter celebration known as Yule involved elaborate feasting, gift-giving, and ceremonial activities that demonstrated community prosperity while honoring ancestors and ensuring supernatural protection for the coming year. Spring festivals celebrated renewal and fertility, rituals designed to ensure successful crops and healthy livestock while marking the end of winter's hardships. Harvest celebrations provided opportunities for communities to gather, share their prosperity, and prepare for winter while honoring the deities responsible for agricultural abundance. The literary achievements of Saxon culture represent some of the most remarkable intellectual and artistic accomplishments of early medieval Europe, combining sophisticated poetic techniques with profound exploration of themes including heroism, loyalty, mortality, and the relationship between human agency and divine will. The epic poem Beowulf stands as the greatest achievement of Saxon literature, presenting a complex narrative that weaves together heroic adventure, political commentary, and philosophical reflection within a framework of remarkable poetic artistry. The poem's treatment of kingship, warrior loyalty, and the struggle against monstrous enemies reflects Saxon social values, while exploring universal themes that transcend cultural boundaries. The composition and preservation of Beowulf required sophisticated literary culture that included not only skilled poets capable of creating complex narratives, but also scribal traditions that could record and transmit oral literature in written form. The poem demonstrates intimate knowledge of Scandinavian geography, genealogy, and legendary material, suggesting continued cultural connections between Anglo-Saxon England and the continental Germanic homeland. The archaeological correlations between the poem's material culture and actual Saxon artifacts reveal the accuracy of the poet's knowledge about weapons, jewelry, halls, and other elements of aristocratic life. Historical chronicles produced in Saxon monasteries created new forms of literature that combined Christian historical writing with Germanic narrative traditions, producing works that served both practical and artistic purposes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle represents the most ambitious attempt to create a comprehensive historical record of English events, combining information from multiple sources including earlier chronicles, royal records, and oral traditions. The Chronicle's treatment of political events reveals sophisticated understanding of causation and historical development, while preserving valuable information about social conditions, economic activities, and cultural changes that would otherwise be lost. The development of Old English vernacular literature represented a remarkable innovation that elevated the Germanic vernacular to a level of sophistication previously reserved for Latin, creating a literary language capable of expressing complex theological, philosophical, and artistic concepts. Saxon poets and prose writers developed sophisticated techniques for adapting Latin literary models to Germanic linguistic structures and cultural values, creating hybrid forms that combined classical learning with native traditions. The translation movement initiated by King Alfred the Great demonstrated the potential for vernacular literature to serve educational and cultural functions, previously monopolized by Latin texts, making sophisticated learning accessible to broad audiences while preserving and developing native intellectual traditions. The monastery of Lindisfarne stood as a beacon of Christian learning and artistic achievement in the Northumbrian kingdom, its scripturum producing illuminated manuscripts that rivaled any created in continental Europe, while its library housed one of the finest collections of theological and classical texts north of the Alps. The monastic community had flourished for over a century on Holy Island, protected by the surrounding tidal waters and sustained by generous royal patronage that had made it wealthy beyond the dreams of most secular settlements. The monks rose each morning for lauds in their stone church, its walls decorated with carved crosses and painted scenes from Scripture, while the monastery's workshops produced intricate metal work, carved ivory, and the precious books that made Lindisfarne famous throughout the Christian world. On June 8, 793, this peaceful routine was shattered forever when Viking longships appeared off the Northumbrian coast, their crews having navigated the treacherous waters around the island with a precision that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of local conditions. The Viking assault on Lindisfarne demonstrated tactical sophistication that went far beyond simple piratical raiding, with coordinated attacks that targeted specific buildings and objectives while minimizing the raiders' exposure to potential counterattack. The attackers struck at dawn when the monks were gathered for morning prayers, using their knowledge of monastic routines to maximize surprise while ensuring that the community's portable wealth would be concentrated in easily accessible locations. The raiders systematically looted the monastery's treasury, stripping gold and silver ornaments from the altar, seizing illuminated manuscripts whose precious metal decorations could be melted down, and capturing monks who could be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets. The attack lasted only a few hours, but its psychological impact reverberated throughout Anglo-Saxon England as news spread that even the most sacred Christian sites were vulnerable to heathen assault. The Lindisfarne raid marked the beginning of a new phase in Viking activity that would transform the political and military landscape of Anglo-Saxon England over the following century. Earlier Scandinavian contacts with Britain had involved primarily trade and diplomatic relationships with occasional small-scale raids that posed no serious threat to established kingdoms. The 793 attack revealed the existence of Viking fleets capable of striking targets hundreds of miles from their home bases, equipped with detailed intelligence about local conditions and defended by warriors whose weapons and tactics were specifically adapted to rapid amphibious operations. The success of the Lindisfarne raid encouraged further Viking expeditions that gradually escalated from isolated attacks on monasteries to systematic campaigns against major political centers. The Viking longships that carried these raiders represented the culmination of centuries of Scandinavian shipbuilding innovation, with vessels specifically designed for the shallow coastal waters and river systems that provided access to Anglo-Saxon targets. These ships typically measured between 60 and 100 feet in length, with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers far inland while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for open sea voyages. The flexible construction techniques employed overlapping planks secured with iron rivets created hulls that could flex with ocean swells while remaining watertight under extreme conditions. Each ship carried crews of 30 to 60 warriors who served as both oarsmen and fighters, with specialized equipment that included shields designed to protect rowers during combat and weapons optimized for fighting in confined shipboard conditions. The escalation of Viking activity during the first half of the 9th century followed patterns that revealed increasingly sophisticated strategic thinking among Scandinavian leaders who recognized the wealth and vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Individual raids gave way to coordinated campaigns involving multiple fleets that could strike simultaneously at widely separated targets, preventing Saxon forces from concentrating their defensive efforts while maximizing the raiders' opportunities for profit. The Vikings demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their choice of targets, shifting their focus from isolated monasteries to commercial centers, royal estates, and strategic fortifications as Saxon defensive measures evolved to counter their tactics. The presence of Viking winter camps in Ireland and Scotland provided forward bases that reduced the logistical challenges of extended campaigns while offering secure retreats when Saxon resistance proved too formidable. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 represented a fundamental shift from raiding to conquest, as a coalition of Viking forces estimated to number several thousand warriors established permanent bases in Anglo-Saxon territory with the clear intention of territorial occupation rather than temporary plunder. Contemporary sources describe this army as larger and better organized than any previous Viking force, with sophisticated supply systems, coordinated leadership, and strategic objectives that extended beyond immediate material gain to encompass long-term political control. The army's composition included not only warriors, but also craftsmen, merchants, and other specialists necessary for establishing permanent settlements, while its leadership demonstrated familiarity with Saxon political divisions and military capabilities that suggested extensive intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The great heathen army's initial campaigns targeted East Anglia and Northumbria, kingdoms whose internal divisions and recent military setbacks had weakened their capacity for organized resistance. The Vikings established fortified bases at strategic locations, including York and the Ford, using these strongholds as launching points for further expansion while providing secure refuge where their forces could regroup and resupply. The army's tactical approach combined traditional Viking mobility with innovations adapted to continental warfare, including the use of cavalry forces and siege equipment that enabled them to assault fortified positions that had previously been immune to Viking attack. Archaeological evidence from Viking camps reveals sophisticated defensive earthworks, organized internal layouts, and evidence for craft production that indicates long-term occupation rather than temporary military encampments. The Viking conquest of York in 866 demonstrated their ability to capture and hold major urban centers, transforming the former Northumbrian capital into the administrative center of what would become the Kingdom of Jorvik. The Vikings' occupation of York revealed their understanding of the economic and strategic value of established urban centers with archaeological evidence showing continued commercial activity under Viking rule alongside new forms of craft, production and trade relationships. The transformation of York's street layout, building styles, and material culture reflects the gradual integration of Scandinavian and Saxon populations under Viking political control, creating hybrid cultural forms that would characterize the Danelaw for centuries. Alfred the Great's succession to the throne of Wessex in 871 occurred at the moment of greatest crisis for Anglo-Saxon England, with Viking armies controlling large portions of the country and traditional defensive systems proving inadequate against sustained Scandinavian assault. Alfred inherited a kingdom under direct military threat, with Viking forces having established permanent bases within striking distance of the West Saxon heartland and traditional allies either conquered or neutralized by Viking expansion. The young king's initial military experiences consisted primarily of desperate defensive actions against Viking armies whose superior mobility and tactical flexibility had overwhelmed Saxon resistance throughout eastern England. The Battle of Ashdown in 871, where Alfred served as second in command to his brother Ethelred, provided crucial insights into Viking military methods while demonstrating that Saxon forces could achieve tactical success against Viking armies under favorable conditions. Alfred's military reforms began during the darkest period of his reign, when Viking pressure had forced him to retreat to the Somerset marshes around Athley, where he maintained organized resistance while developing new approaches to counter Viking tactical advantages. The creation of the Fyrd system represented Alfred's most significant military innovation, transforming the traditional Saxon obligation for military service into a systematic defensive network capable of rapid mobilization against Viking threats. The reformed Fyrd divided the available military manpower into two groups that served alternating periods of active duty, ensuring that trained forces were always available for immediate deployment while allowing agricultural and economic activities to continue during periods of military crisis. The Fyrd system's effectiveness depended upon careful coordination between local commanders and royal officials who could assess threats, mobilize appropriate forces, and coordinate defensive responses across wide geographical areas. Alfred's military reforms included the establishment of standardized equipment requirements for feared service with specific provisions for weapons, armor, and supplies that ensured consistent combat capability while distributing the financial burden of military preparation across the entire population. The system incorporated lessons learned from Viking tactics, including emphasis on mobility, rapid deployment, and the ability to maintain organized resistance, even when traditional defensive positions had been compromised. The burh network that Alfred established across Wessex represented a revolutionary approach to territorial defense that combined military fortification with urban development and economic growth. These fortified centers were positioned at strategic locations throughout the kingdom, typically spaced no more than 20 m apart to ensure that no settlement was more than a day's march from defensive shelter. Each burh was designed to serve multiple functions, providing military strongholds that could resist Viking assault while serving as commercial centers that attracted merchants and craftsmen whose activities generated the economic resources necessary to maintain defensive preparations. The construction of these fortifications required massive investments of labor and materials, with archaeological evidence revealing sophisticated engineering that incorporated lessons learned from both Roman military architecture and contemporary continental fortification techniques. The Burgle HD, a document that recorded the defensive obligations associated with each burh, reveals the systematic planning that underlay Alfred's defensive strategy. Each fortified center was assigned a specific number of hides of land whose inhabitants were responsible for maintaining designated sections of the fortification walls, creating a comprehensive system that distributed defensive responsibilities while ensuring adequate manpower for both construction and garrison duties. The document specifies that each hide was responsible for maintaining 4 feet of wall, with calculations that suggest total defensive perimeters exceeding 27,000 feet across the entire network. This system created permanent defensive infrastructure that could withstand prolonged siege while providing secure bases from which Saxon forces could launch counterattacks against Viking armies. Alfred's naval innovations addressed one of the fundamental advantages that had enabled Viking success throughout the 9th century. The Saxon kingdoms had possessed no maritime forces capable of intercepting Viking fleets or preventing their access to inland targets via river systems. The construction of a royal navy required not only shipbuilding expertise, but also the development of new tactical doctrines adapted to countering Viking naval superiority. Alfred's ships were designed to be larger and more heavily armed than typical Viking vessels, with crews trained specifically for naval combat rather than the amphibious operations that characterize Viking warfare. Archaeological evidence from ship finds suggests that these vessels incorporated design elements borrowed from both Scandinavian and continental European shipbuilding traditions while adapting to the specific requirements of defensive naval operations. The naval campaigns conducted under Alfred's direction achieved notable successes against Viking fleets, with contemporary sources recording victories that demonstrated the potential effectiveness of Saxon naval forces when properly organized and equipped. The Battle of the Swale in 885 saw Alfred's ships defeat a Viking fleet attempting to raid Kent, capturing several enemy vessels and forcing the survivors to retreat without achieving their objectives. These naval victories provided crucial psychological benefits by demonstrating that Viking maritime superiority was not absolute while offering practical advantages by disrupting Viking supply lines and reducing their operational flexibility. The establishment of the Danelaw through the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum around 886 created a formal division of England that recognized Viking territorial control over large areas of eastern and northern England while establishing boundaries and legal frameworks for ongoing coexistence. The treaty defined the frontier between Saxon and Viking territories along a line running roughly from London to Chester, with detailed provisions for trade relationships, legal procedures, and diplomatic protocols that would govern interactions between the two populations. The agreement represented a pragmatic recognition that neither side possessed the military capability to achieve complete victory while establishing frameworks that could prevent minor disputes from escalating into renewed warfare. The Danelaw's internal organization reflected the adaptation of Scandinavian political and legal traditions to the realities of governing settled agricultural populations in England. Viking settlers established administrative centers at major towns including York, Lincoln, Stamford, Leicester, and Derby, creating a network of fortified bases that could coordinate military activities while serving as commercial and judicial centers for surrounding rural areas. The legal system that developed in these territories combined elements of Scandinavian law with Saxon legal traditions and practical adaptations to local conditions, creating hybrid legal cultures that would influence English legal development for centuries. The cultural impact of Danelaw settlement extended far beyond simple political control to encompass fundamental changes in language, place names, social organization, and economic activities that reflected the integration of Scandinavian and Saxon populations. Archaeological evidence from Danelaw settlements reveals material culture that combines Scandinavian and Saxon elements with pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and building construction methods that reflects cultural synthesis rather than simple conquest. The linguistic evidence for this cultural integration includes the adoption of hundreds of Scandinavian words into English vocabulary, particularly terms related to legal concepts, agricultural practices, and social relationships that indicate sustained contact and intermarriage between Viking and Saxon populations. The economic transformation of Danelaw territories involved the development of new commercial networks that connected Scandinavian England with trading partners across the North Sea and Baltic regions. Viking merchants established trading relationships that brought Scandinavian goods, including amber, furs, and specialized metal work to English markets while exporting English agricultural products, textiles, and manufactured goods to Scandinavian and continental European customers. The presence of Scandinavian coins and commercial weights in English archaeological sites demonstrates the extent of these commercial relationships while revealing the sophisticated commercial practices that Viking settlers brought to their new territories. The reconquest campaigns initiated by Edward the Elder represented the beginning of systematic efforts to reunite England under Saxon rule with military strategies that built upon Alfred's defensive innovations while developing new approaches to offensive warfare against established Viking territories. Edward's campaigns combined traditional Saxon military strengths with tactical innovations borrowed from Viking warfare, including improved cavalry forces, sophisticated siege techniques, and coordinated amphibious operations that could challenge Viking defensive advantages. The systematic nature of these campaigns involve careful preparation, including intelligence gathering, supply organization, and diplomatic efforts to isolate Viking territories from potential Scandinavian reinforcement. Æthelflæd of Mercia emerged as one of the most effective military leaders of the Reconquest period, demonstrating strategic and tactical skills that complemented her brother Edward's campaigns while extending Saxon influence into areas that had been under Viking control for decades. Her fortification of towns throughout Western Mia created defensive networks that protected Saxon territories while providing bases for offensive operations against Viking strongholds. The coordination between Edward and Ethelf's campaigns reveal sophisticated strategic planning that could synchronize military operations across wide geographical areas while maintaining pressure on multiple Viking territories simultaneously. The Siege of Derby in 917 demonstrated the effectiveness of the new Saxon military methods, with Edward's forces successfully capturing one of the 5 major Viking strongholds through a combination of direct assault and strategic isolation that prevented Viking reinforcement. The campaign's success required sophisticated logistical planning that could maintain siege forces for extended periods while coordinating with other military operations that prevented Viking forces from concentrating their defensive efforts. Archaeological evidence from Derby reveals the extent of fortification works that the Vikings had constructed to defend the town, while also showing the systematic destruction that accompanied its Saxon recapture. Æthelstan's victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 represented the culmination of the reconquest campaigns, with a decisive Saxon victory over a coalition of Viking, Scottish, and Irish forces that had threatened to reverse the territorial gains achieved by Edward and Æthelflæ. The battle involved the largest armies assembled in Britain since the Roman period, with contemporary sources describing fighting that lasted an entire day and resulted in enormous casualties on both sides. Æthelstan's victory eliminated the last serious challenge to Saxon control over northern England, while establishing his reputation as the first king to exercise effective authority over the entire English territory south of the Scottish border. The consolidation of English territory under the House of Wessex following Æthelstan's triumph at Brunanburh ushered in an era of unprecedented political sophistication that transformed the fragmented kingdoms of earlier centuries into a unified realm capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that rivaled the greatest continental powers. The administrative machinery that emerged during the 10th century represented a remarkable synthesis of Saxon governmental traditions with innovations borrowed from Carolingian and Byzantine models, creating centralized institutions that could coordinate activities across territories, stretching from Cornwall to Northland while maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate regional variations in law, custom, and economic organization. The royal household evolved from the personal retinue of warrior kings into a complex bureaucratic apparatus staffed by literate officials who maintained written records, administered royal estates, and coordinated the collection of taxes and military obligations that provided the material foundation for royal authority. The development of Shia administration under Edgar and his successors created a hierarchical governmental structure that extended royal authority into every corner of the kingdom through appointed officials whose responsibilities encompassed judicial, military, and fiscal functions. Each shire was governed by an older, whose authority derived directly from royal appointment and who served as the king's representative in all matters of local governance. These officials typically controlled substantial personal estates that provided them with the economic resources necessary to maintain their position while ensuring their continued loyalty to the crown. Through the careful distribution of royal patronage, the Shia courts that met regularly under alderman supervision provided forums for the administration of justice, the resolution of disputes, and the conduct of administrative business that connected local communities directly to royal authority. Beneath the eldermen, the reeves who administered individual hundreds created an additional layer of royal authority. that penetrated to the village level, ensuring that royal commands could be transmitted throughout the kingdom while providing mechanisms for the upward flow of information about local conditions, potential threats, and available resources. The 100 courts that met monthly under Reeves' supervision handled the vast majority of legal disputes while serving as venues for the proclamation of royal legislation and the coordination of local contributions to royal military campaigns. This administrative network created unprecedented governmental capacity that enabled Anglo-Saxon kings to mobilize resources more effectively than any previous English rulers while maintaining detailed knowledge of conditions throughout their territories. The royal writing office that developed during this period produced the stream of writs, charters, and administrative documents that provided the legal and bureaucratic foundation for centralized governance. These documents reveal sophisticated approaches to record-keeping that incorporated continental European diplomatic practices while adapting to specifically English legal and administrative requirements. The standardization of documentary forms, the development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon diplomatic protocols, and the maintenance of comprehensive archives created governmental capabilities that enable consistent policy implementation across vast territories while preserving the legal precedents necessary for effective judicial administration. The survival of thousands of these documents provides unprecedented insight into the daily operations of Anglo-Saxon government and the remarkable administrative sophistication that characterized the mature Anglo-Saxon state. The economic prosperity that supported these governmental innovations rested upon agricultural improvements, commercial expansion, and monetary developments that generated unprecedented levels of surplus wealth for both royal and private consumption. The agricultural revolution of the 10th and 11th centuries involved the introduction of new crops, improved farming techniques, and more efficient land management practices that significantly increase productivity, while supporting larger populations. The widespread adoption of the heavy plow enabled the cultivation of previously marginal soils, while the development of systematic crop rotation maintained soil fertility while maximizing yields. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements revealed substantial population growth during this period, with new villages established in previously uninhabited areas and existing settlements expanding beyond their original boundaries. The expansion of commercial activity during this period created urban centers that served as focal points for regional and long-distance trade while generating the tax revenues that supported royal administration and military activities. Towns like Winchester, London, York, and Chester developed into substantial commercial centers with populations numbering in the thousands, supported by craft production, trade, and administrative functions that created economic opportunities for merchants, artisans, and service providers. The archaeological record from these urban centers reveals sophisticated commercial infrastructure, including specialized workshops, storage facilities, and residential areas that accommodated diverse populations engaged in various economic activities. The monetary system that emerged during the 10th century represented one of the most advanced in contemporary Europe, with standardized silver pennies produced at royal mints throughout the kingdom under strict quality controls that ensured consistent weight and purity. The regular recoinage programs implemented by Anglo-Saxon kings prevented the debasement and where that plagued other medieval monetary systems, while generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The geographical distribution of mint locations reveals the extent of royal administrative control, with mints operating in over 60 locations during the reign of Ethelred the Unready. each producing coins that bore the king's image and titles while conforming to exacting standards of weight and silver content. The sophistication of Anglo-Saxon monetary policy extended beyond simple coinage to encompass complex fiscal arrangements, including the collection of taxes, the payment of military wages, and the administration of royal estates that generated revenues supporting governmental operations. The gel system that developed during this period created mechanisms for the systematic collection of taxes based on land assessments that could be adjusted to meet changing royal financial requirements. The ability to collect taxes in silver coin rather than agricultural produce or labor service provided Anglo-Saxon kings with unprecedented flexibility in military and administrative planning while creating monetary circulation that facilitated commercial development throughout the kingdom. The cultural achievements of this period encompassed architectural innovations, manuscript production, and scholarly activities that rivaled contemporary developments in continental Europe while maintaining distinctively English characteristics that reflected the synthesis of Saxon, Scandinavian, and continental influences. The late Saxon churches that were constructed during the 10th and 11th centuries demonstrate sophisticated architectural knowledge that incorporated continental Romanesque elements while adapting to local materials and building traditions. These structures typically featured stone construction with elaborate decorative elements including carved capitals, sculptural programs, and architectural details that reveal contact with continental artistic developments, while maintaining distinctively English stylistic characteristics. The Church of St. Lawrence at Bradford-on-Avon exemplifies the architectural sophistication achieved by late Saxon builders with its carefully proportioned nave, elaborate sculptural decoration, and sophisticated masonry techniques that demonstrate mastery of advanced building methods. The structure's architectural details reveal knowledge of continental Romanesque developments while incorporating decorative elements that reflect specifically English artistic traditions. Similar achievements can be observed at churches throughout England where late Saxon builders created structures that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic sophistication while serving the liturgical requirements of Reformed Benedictine monasticism. The manuscript production centers that flourished during this period created some of the finest illuminated books produced anywhere in medieval Europe, combining sophisticated artistic techniques with scholarly content that reflected the intellectual achievements of the Benedictine Reform movement. The Winchester School of Manuscript illumination achieved international recognition for its distinctive style that combined Byzantine artistic influences with Carolean decorative traditions and indigenous English elements. The manuscripts produced at Winchester and other centers demonstrate sophisticated understanding of classical artistic principles while developing innovative approaches to page layout, decorative integration, and iconographic programs that enhance the spiritual and intellectual impact of their contents. The Benedictional of St. Ethelwald represents perhaps the finest achievement of Anglo-Saxon manuscript art with its elaborate miniatures, sophisticated decorative borders, and innovative use of gold and silver that created visual effects of unprecedented richness and complexity. The manuscript's artistic program reveals detailed knowledge of continental European artistic developments while demonstrating the distinctive aesthetic sensibilities that characterized English artistic production during this period. The technical sophistication evident in the manuscript's production required specialized knowledge of pigment preparation, gold leaf application, and parchment treatment that indicates the existence of highly trained scripturums, with access to expensive materials and advanced artistic knowledge. The scholarly activities centered in reformed Benedictine monasteries created intellectual achievements that contributed significantly to European learning while preserving and transmitting classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The monastic schools established at Winchester, Glastonbury, Abingdon, and other centers provided education that combined traditional liberal arts instruction with specialized training in theology, canon law, and liturgical studies. These institutions attracted students from throughout Europe while maintaining correspondence with continental scholars that facilitated intellectual exchange and collaborative scholarly projects. Alfred of emerged as one of the most significant scholars of the period, producing educational works that made sophisticated theological and philosophical concepts accessible to English audiences while maintaining scholarly standards that earned international recognition. His Catholic homilies provided systematic theological instruction adapted to the needs of parish clergy, while his Lives of Saints created vernacular hagiographical literature that combined scholarly accuracy with popular appeal. The linguistic sophistication of Alfred's prose demonstrates the maturity achieved by Old English as a literary and scholarly medium capable of expressing complex intellectual concepts with precision and elegance. The development of vernacular historical writing during this period created new forms of historical consciousness that combined Christian providential history with Germanic heroic traditions and contemporary political concerns. The various versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle produced at different monastic centers reveal sophisticated approaches to historical writing that incorporated multiple sources while maintaining distinctive regional perspectives on national events. The chroniclers demonstrated remarkable skill in organizing complex historical material, while providing interpretive frameworks that helped readers understand the significance of contemporary developments within broader historical contexts. Military innovations during this period reflected the ongoing challenges posed by renewed Viking activity and the eventual Norman threat, forcing Anglo-Saxon military leaders to adapt traditional tactics while incorporating new technologies and organizational methods borrowed from continental European warfare. The household troops that form the core of royal armies evolve from traditional Germanic war bands into professional military units equipped with standardized weapons and trained in coordinated tactical maneuvers. These forces typically included heavily armored infantry armed with spears, swords, and large shields supported by archers and cavalry units that provided tactical flexibility in different combat situations. The development of castle building techniques during the 11th century represented a significant departure from traditional Saxon fortification methods, with the construction of modern bailey fortifications that incorporated continental European military architecture while adapting to English defensive requirements. These fortifications typically featured artificial mounds topped with wooden towers and surrounded by enclosed courtyards protected by earthwork defenses and wooden palisades. The rapid construction techniques employed in building these fortifications enabled defensive preparations that could respond quickly to changing military threats while providing secure bases for offensive operations. The military reforms implemented during the reign of Edward the Confessor included the recruitment of continental European military specialists who brought knowledge of new tactical methods, siege techniques, and military technologies that enhanced Anglo-Saxon military capabilities. The presence of Norman, Flemish, and French warriors in royal service introduced cavalry tactics, crossbow technology, and siege warfare methods that would prove crucial in subsequent military campaigns. These foreign military advisors also provided intelligence about continental military developments while serving as diplomatic links with potential allies and enemies across the Channel. The naval developments of this period reflected the continued importance of maritime defense in protecting English territories from Scandinavian and continental threats. The royal fleets, maintained by Anglo-Saxon kings, included both traditional long ships adapted for coastal defense and larger vessels designed for extended operations in the North Sea and English Channel. The fleets required sophisticated logistical support, including specialized harbors, supply systems, and recruitment mechanisms that could provide the trained crews necessary for effective naval operations. The archaeological evidence for shipbuilding activities at sites like London and Southampton reveals the technological sophistication achieved by Anglo-Saxon shipwrights while demonstrating the resources committed to naval defense. The response to renewed Viking threats during the reign of Ethelred the Unready revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the mature Anglo-Saxon state. The sophisticated administrative and military systems proved capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources while struggling to counter the tactical innovations employed by new generations of Scandinavian raiders. The payment of Danegeld represented a pragmatic response to Viking pressure that utilized the kingdom's advanced monetary system to purchase temporary peace while providing time for military preparations. However, the enormous sums involved in these payments, totaling over 150,000 of silver during Ethelred's reign, strained royal finances while encouraging further Viking expeditions. Attracted by the prospect of substantial profits, the military campaigns of Sween, Forkbeard, and Kennet demonstrated the evolution of Viking warfare from the raiding tactics of earlier centuries to systematic conquest campaigns that incorporated continental European military methods with traditional Scandinavian naval superiority. These campaigns employed coordinated land and sea operations, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and diplomatic initiatives that isolated Anglo-Saxon resistance while building coalitions of English nobles willing to accept Scandinavian rule. The success of these campaigns reflected not only military superiority, but also the political sophistication that characterized 11th century Scandinavian kingship. The reign of Ket as King of England created a North Sea empire that connected English resources with Scandinavian military power and continental European diplomatic networks, demonstrating the international significance achieved by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom during its final century. Kian's administrative policies combined respect for English legal and governmental traditions with innovations borrowed from continental European royal practice, creating hybrid governmental forms that maintained administrative efficiency while accommodating the diverse populations under his rule. The cultural synthesis that characterized Cut's reign produced artistic and literary achievements that reflected the cosmopolitan character of his court while maintaining distinctively English characteristics. The restoration of the House of Wessex under Edward the Confessor marked the final phase of independent Anglo-Saxon rule, characterized by continued cultural achievements and administrative sophistication that occurred alongside growing continental European influence that would ultimately facilitate the Norman conquest. Edward's continental connections established during his long exile in Normandy introduced new architectural styles, artistic influences, and political relationships that gradually transformed the character of English court culture while maintaining traditional Anglo-Saxon governmental and legal institutions. The tension between continuity and change that characterized Edward's reign created the conditions that would enable William of Normandy to claim the English throne while ensuring that the conquest would encounter sophisticated resistance. From a kingdom that had achieved remarkable political and cultural maturity. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5, 1066 precipitated the most decisive succession crisis in English history as three formidable claimants assembled armies to contest the throne of the most prosperous kingdom in northwestern Europe. Harold Godwinson's coronation. The day after Edward's death represented the culmination of his family's decadescal-long accumulation of power and influence. Yet his claim rested primarily on Edward's alleged deathbed designation and the Vidinacumats. Immediate approval rather than blood relationship to the royal house. Across the Channel, William of Normandy prepared for invasion based on his assertion that Edward had promised him the succession years earlier and that Harold had sworn to support his claim during a diplomatic mission to Normandy. Meanwhile, Harald Hardrada of Norway marshaled forces for his own invasion, claiming the English throne through agreements allegedly made between his predecessor Magnus and Haranut decades earlier. The military preparations undertaken by each claimant revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that 11th-century rulers could mobilize for major campaigns. William's invasion force required the construction of a substantial fleet capable of transporting not only thousands of warriors but also their horses, equipment, and supplies necessary for extended operations in hostile territory. Norman chroniclers described the assembly of over 700 vessels at the mouth of the Dives River with specialized horse transports designed to carry the heavy cavalry that formed the core of William's military advantage. The Duke's diplomatic efforts secured papal blessing for his enterprise, transforming what might have appeared as naked aggression into a righteous campaign to restore legitimate authority and reform the English Church according to continental standards. Harold Godwinson's defensive preparations demonstrated the administrative sophistication of the Anglo-Saxon state as the king mobilized both professional household troops and the broader feared system that could theoretically place every able-bodied freeman under arms. The coastal defenses established along the southern shore included not only permanent fortifications, but also mobile forces positioned to respond rapidly to invasion attempts at various landing sites. Harold's strategy required maintaining these defensive positions throughout the summer sailing season while keeping substantial forces available for deployment against potential northern threats. The strain of maintaining such extensive defensive preparations for months tested the resources of even the wealthy English kingdom. The Norwegian invasion that materialized in September 1066 caught Harold's forces positioned primarily along the southern coast, requiring rapid redeployment of military resources to counter Herod at a substantial army that had landed in Yorkshire with the support of Harold's exiled brother Tostig. The Norwegian force included an estimated 300 ships, carrying perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 warriors, representing one of the largest invasion armies assembled during the medieval period. Hardrada's forces included not only Norwegian troops, but also warriors recruited from throughout Scandinavia, creating a formidable military coalition that posed a serious threat to Harold's newly established reign. The Battle of Fulford on September 20, 1066 demonstrated both the continuing effectiveness of Scandinavian military methods and the vulnerability of English forces when caught without adequate preparation. The Ears Edwin and Morcar, commanding the northern English forces, attempted to prevent the Norwegian advance on York, but suffered a devastating defeat that eliminated organized resistance in Yorkshire, while opening the path to the kingdom's second most important city. The Norwegian Victory at Fulford forced Harold to abandon his southern defensive positions and march north with whatever forces he could rapidly assemble, leaving the Channel coast vulnerable to Norman invasion. Harold's march north with his household troops represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in medieval military history, as the king covered the 190 m from London to Yorkshire in just 4 days while maintaining his army's combat effectiveness. The speed of this movement reflected both the efficiency of Anglo-Saxon administrative systems and the quality of the kingdom's road network, which enabled rapid communication and troop movement that gave English forces crucial tactical advantages. Harold's ability to surprise the Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge resulted from this rapid deployment, combined with effective intelligence gathering that revealed the enemy's dispositions and defensive preparations. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, marked the end of the Viking Age as a major factor in English politics, with Harold's forces achieving a decisive victory that eliminated Hardrada and shattered the Norwegian invasion force. The battle began with individual combat between a Norwegian warrior who held the bridge against the entire English army, until an Anglo-Saxon soldier floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and speared him from below. The main engagement that followed saw Harold's forces employ traditional Saxon shield wall tactics enhanced by improved weapons and armor that proved superior to Norwegian equipment and methods. The crushing defeat of the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge left Harold Godwinson's army both victorious and exhausted. Of the 300 ships Harold Hardrada had brought, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Yet as Harold celebrated in the north, Duke William of Normandy landed unopposed at Pevensey on September 28, 1066. Delayed for weeks by contrary winds, William's timing proved fortunate. Harold had destroyed the Viking threat, but at the cost of fatigue and heavy losses. The Normans quickly built fortifications and devastated the countryside to provoke battle and demonstrate the consequences of resistance. Archaeological remains and the Bayeux Tapestry confirm widespread burning and pillaging in Sussex. Despite exhaustion, Harold marched south without waiting for reinforcements, determined to confront William. His army, composed of household troops and local levies, took position on Senlac Hill on October 14. The English relied on their time-tested tactic, the shield wall, a dense formation of heavily armed infantry with overlapping shields. Positioned on high ground with flanks secured by rough terrain, Harold's men held a formidable defensive stance. The Norman army showcased the evolving sophistication of continental warfare. William's forces included heavy cavalry on powerful warhorses, disciplined infantry, and archers wielding crossbows and composite bows, capabilities the Saxons lacked. Coordinating these arms required tactical skill, the product of decades of Norman military development. The battle opened with sustained volleys of Norman arrows, but the English shield wall held firm. Cavalry charges also faltered, as Saxon axes hacked down horses and riders who came too close. For hours the English position seemed unbreakable. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts Norman knights dragged from saddles and struck down by Saxon warriors. Crisis struck when rumors spread that William had fallen. The Norman line wavered until the Duke lifted his helmet to reveal himself, restoring confidence. Seizing initiative, William employed a new tactic, feigned retreats. When sections of his cavalry pretended to flee, undisciplined Saxons pursued them, breaking the cohesion of the shield wall. Norman horsemen then wheeled around and cut them down. Repeated withdrawals gradually weakened the English formation. As the battle wore on, Harold was killed. Tradition holds by an arrow to the eye, though accounts differ. His brothers Jardich and Leofwine also fell, and with them the last coherent Saxon leadership. The shield wall collapsed, and what remained of the English army scattered. The victory was decisive. With Harold dead and much of the Anglo-Saxon elite destroyed, resistance crumbled. William advanced rapidly, establishing garrisons and building castles to secure control. London submitted, and on Christmas Day 1066 he was crowned king at Westminster Abbey, linking Norman rule to Saxon traditions of legitimacy. The conquest, however, was not merely military. William replaced English nobles with Norman followers, using legal confiscation and feudal land grants to reshape the aristocracy. The construction of castles, motte and bailey fortifications appearing across the countryside, both secured Norman power and symbolized permanence. Ecclesiastical leadership was also transformed. Norman clergy replaced Saxon bishops, while Archbishop Lanfranc introduced continental reforms that aligned the English Church with wider European developments. Resistance did not vanish immediately. Rebellions in the north, supported by Danish allies, forced William into harsh countermeasures. The harrying of the north in 1069–70 devastated Yorkshire, destroying crops, villages, and tools to create famine and prevent further uprisings. Chroniclers describe desolation lasting for decades. Other uprisings followed, such as Hereward the Wake's guerrilla resistance in the Fens, but all were eventually suppressed. By 1086, the Domesday Book recorded the transformation of English society. Nearly all major estates had passed to Norman hands, though Saxon administrative systems, shires, hundreds, and local courts remained intact and now served the conquerors. The survey also revealed the remarkable efficiency of both Saxon and Norman governance, capturing details of landholding, population, and resources unmatched in medieval Europe. Norman rule reshaped English culture and language. Latin remained the language of the Church, French became the speech of the court and nobility, and Old English persisted among the population. Over time these layers fused, producing Middle English, a Germanic grammar infused with French vocabulary. The result was a trilingual society, stratified by class but culturally dynamic. Yet despite military defeat, the Saxon legacy endured deeply. Place names across England preserve Saxon roots, as do thousands of everyday English words, family terms, farming vocabulary, and basic legal concepts. Words like king, lord, home, and law survived where Norman alternatives faded. Saxon grammatical patterns shaped English sentence structure, compound word formation, and poetic traditions. Legal and political institutions proved equally resilient. Saxon traditions of community justice, shire courts, and participatory decision-making evolved into the English common law and parliamentary system. The Witan, the King's Advisory Council, foreshadowed later parliaments, while practices requiring taxation with consent anticipated constitutional principles centuries later. Trial by jury, community compensation, and emphasis on precedent all stemmed from Saxon legal practice. Cultural achievements were no less significant. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in the vernacular, created a model for national historical writing. Poetic traditions, epitomized by Beowulf, influenced English literature for centuries with their alliterative style and heroic themes. Monastic centers such as Wearmouth and Jarrow preserved classical learning, produced illuminated manuscripts, and developed educational systems that linked England to continental intellectual life. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this legacy. The Sutton Hoo ship burial revealed the wealth and craftsmanship of early Saxon elites, while excavations at towns like Hamwick and Londonwick demonstrate sophisticated urban life, craft specialization, and trade networks spanning Europe and beyond. Far from barbaric, Saxon society combined Germanic traditions with innovations that shaped medieval Europe. In the long view, the Norman conquest ended Saxon political independence but not their influence. Instead, it produced a hybrid Anglo-Norman civilization. Norman castles and cathedrals stood beside Saxon villages and fields. French vocabulary enriched an Old English core. Feudal aristocracy ruled through Saxon legal frameworks. Together they laid the foundations of English identity. The Saxons' greatest legacy was endurance. Their governmental structures underpinned Norman administration. Their legal principles shaped common law. Their language became the backbone of English, and their literature and chronicles preserved memory and culture. Though defeated on the battlefield, the Saxons remained at the heart of English civilization, their influence echoing through law, language, and identity into the modern world.